All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Megan, and I am joined tonight by author LM or Laura Elliott and Jessie Serfilippi from the Schuyler Mansion, who is also a writer. And we are here to talk about Peggy Schuyler. Today is the 262nd anniversary of Peggy's birth, and we decided to gather to talk about this lesser known but no less awesome Schuyler sister. So I figured I would start us off by asking Laura to tell a little bit about her book Hamilton and Peggy and what inspired her to write about Peggy.
I'll do it really fast because we want to hear Jessie tell us what she knows, because she is this amazing historical interpreter at the mansion. This was an incredibly wonderful assignment that my brilliant editor, Catherine Teagan at HarperCollins, gave me. I had seen the musical. She knew how I was so moved by it, as everyone is who sees it. And she said, well, why don't you write something about Hamilton? And I didn't want to touch Eliza because she's been written about numerous times beautifully, particularly by Susan Holloway Scott in her I, Eliza Hamilton book, which is so wonderful. And there's so many people, including an interpreter who was working at the Schuyler Mansion as I was researching, who has done amazing research on Angelica. So there was Peggy, with her exuberant and Peggy. By my count, she only had 36 solo words in the musical. And so she felt very much like she could be a kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern backstory narrator who would be fascinating. And the legend that is known about her, the family lore that would make anybody want to write about her, is that there was she rushed into the fray of an attempted kidnapping of her father, General Schuyler, by a band of loyalists and the Iroquois allies. She rushed into that fray to try to save her baby sister, Katie, who had been left in a cradle downstairs because when this home invasion happened, there was a very pregnant Angelica and a pregnant Eliza and all these little small Schuyler children, and they all went rushing upstairs, and everybody got upstairs to safety and kind of, in essence, went, oh my God, where's the baby? And Peggy went running back down through the fray to scoop the baby up and go running back up to safety, by family legend. But I still need to find out if she really warranted an entire book, and we're going to talk a lot about the joys of research and how they can bring, story and character and plot alive. I needed to make sure that she was worthy of an entire book, and so I had to read around about her because there's very little about her herself. And her peers called her a wicked wit, lively, generous, the favorite of dinner tables and balls. She was fluent in French. She was, quote, endowed with a superior mind and a rare accuracy of judgment in men and things. Benjamin Franklin called her Wild Peggy. And one of Hamilton's BFFs, who I have to admit I don't care for very much because of what he said about Peggy, but James McHenry, he criticizes her in a letter to Hamilton as being a Swift's Vanessa. Now, for all your English majors out there, that's Jonathan Swift. And Swift's Vanessa was basically 18th century code for a very smart woman who wanted to talk politics and philosophy with men a little too much to be entirely likable. And he actually concludes his letter to Hamilton saying, tell Peggy so. I'm sure her good sense will soon place her in her proper station. Ha, I don't think so. I think she was very much the intellectual, incredibly well-read, very much a proto-feminist, just like her better-known sister, Angelica. With all those things, that's why I wanted to write about Peggy. And I'll talk more about letters in Hamilton and things like that were amazing reveals of a truly bodacious and independent thinking young woman.
Great, thank you. Jessie.
And I should say, I'm sorry, I wanted to say from the get-go that it wouldn't have happened without the help of the Schuyler Mansion and their incredible generosity in answering about a bazillion questions from me about her.
Cool. So Jessie, how do you all at the Schuyler Mansion, how do you approach researching these historical people that I'm sure you have a lot of questions about because of the musical?
Yeah, so with the Schuyler sisters in particular, especially Peggy actually, there isn't a lot of written letters from her or even to her. So sometimes you have to research around them is what I call it, and I end up reading a lot of the guys' letters. So a lot of Hamilton's letters and Philip Schuyler's letters, and you find those little nuggets where Peggy's mentioned, where they say, oh, Peggy's down in New York City, she's coming up to Albany, so we get a sense of where she's traveling. There's one letter I found from Peggy where she's traveling herself, and she talks about being homesick, which is a really rare look at her, and it's in her hand, which is really cool to see.
Oh,
Neat.
I would love to see that at some point.
So both of you have mentioned that Peggy was very well educated and, she knew her stuff. I know a little bit about the library at the Schuyler Mansion, but how did she educate herself, and what was her education like compared to other women of the time?
I mean, her education was pretty phenomenal. Her father really encouraged his daughters, especially, to be educated. And we think their education started in Albany when they were young. They were bilingual in Dutch and English. And then he sends them to New York City when Peggy was probably about 8 years old, actually, when she got down there, with her two older sisters. And they're tutored by private tutors. They're learning, dance, art, embroidery, but we know they were studying arithmetic, geography, history, and French, which was pretty big. There was a education philosopher at the time who said, your daughters don't need to know French because a good Frenchman knows English, and if he doesn't, you don't want your daughters talking to him.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
That
Well,
is.
her ability with French was something that so many people did remark on, that I found, and you helped guide me to, Ian and Danielle. Jessie has given me all sorts of information as we go forward. And one of those things was, Jessie, you told me that you had found a letter that she taught herself German by reading her father's engineering manuals. Is that essentially right?
Yeah. So someone references her speaking German fluently, and we have not discovered the letter. Like, we had it at one point, and like so many things, it gets shuffled around, and now we're like, oh, where is that? But Danielle or Ian read it and passed it on to me, and we were like, how would she learn German? There's no record of a German tutor. So we looked in Schuyler's library list, and there were German books, and that's why we think she used his engineering books in German to learn the language, and that would definitely fit Peggy. I can see her doing that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's wonderful.
So
Yeah.
Peggy in the musical, the actor who plays Peggy is, of course, plays Mariah Reynolds in Act 2. So we get this little glimpse of her basically as a late adolescent in Act 1, and then she sort of vanishes. And when Lin-Manuel Miranda was interviewed about it or asked about it, he said, well, she died young and sort of wasn't as relevant to the story and that sort of thing, which respect, man's very talented, but that's not necessarily true. Could you both speak a little bit to what happens in between, when we meet her in the musical from when she's younger? So what happens, what does adult Peggy do? And what is her journey? And Laura, maybe let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what happens in between when she's a young teenager caught up in the revolution, and sort of where you leave off with the book? And then I'd love to hear Jessie talk a little bit about what happens after that.
Sure. Well, as you say, all hosannas to Lin-Manuel Miranda, who took this, large and extraordinary and complicated life and managed to condense it to a moving, compelling, educational, iconic 90-minute musical. It is extraordinary. And as a writer, and by the way, I'm sorry, I'm with Jessie as a writer as well, and we do want to talk about her essay and the book that she wrote an essay in, and I'll let Jessie do that in a second, because it's a really wonderful collection of fierce women. But as a writer, the reality is that, you know, especially like a historical fiction writer, I estimate that I only am able to use 30 to 40% of the research that I bring in. I find all these incredibly compelling and just as fascinating characters that I don't have space to put in if they don't forward the story of my protagonist, like the Baroness van Rysendal. Am I saying that right, Jessie? Who shows up briefly in the novel. You could write an entire novel about her. She was the wife of the Hessian commander with the British troops during the invasion with Burgoyne, and she keeps this extraordinary memoir of her experiences in that. So I completely understand why, if having to, you know, squash everything and to symbolize the relationships among the sisters, that Peggy could get, to me, short shrift. But what he gets so perfectly is the deep, abiding loyalty and strength of that sisterhood. They looked out for one another. They were indeed friends. And there they are. But here's where truth and fact diverge a little bit. Angelica, I always preface this with, I'm so sorry to all you Angelica fans out there, but she was already married and had children when they all met Hamilton. And actually, within days of meeting Eliza in Morristown, Hamilton will send a letter, a note to Peggy, where he basically is begging her to come to Morristown to be his wingman in his courtship of Eliza. He actually says, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but then I'll stop. This letter that he wrote in February 1780, he says that he's already formed a more than common partiality for Peggy's person and mind because of this miniature portrait that Eliza has painted and is carried with her and is actually shown to him. And he begs Peggy, as this nymph of equal sway, to please come and basically distract all the other aides de camp. He's bemoaned the fact that he's turned into the veriest inamorato you perhaps ever saw. It was Eliza's fault. She made him fall in love with her, and he's fighting it. But please, Peggy, won't you come? He says, by dividing her, Eliza's empire, it will be weakened, and she will be much less dangerous when she has a rival equal in charms to dispute the prize with her. I solicit your aid. So it was indeed Peggy, actually, who is, you know, the sister who's pulled in to be the help. He almost immediately begins calling her my Peggy, my little sister, sprightly Peggy. And just so you know, Peggy rides off into the absolute worst winter ever recorded in American history. There were 28 nor'easters recorded from November 1st until April 1st. There's 6-foot snowdrifts when she goes out to this horrific cold, riding through territory that was controlled by loyalists who would have loved to have captured a Schuyler's daughter to hold as ransom. But she goes. And I think in part because upon reading this letter, and this is, we can talk more, both Jessie and I and you, Megan, can talk about the kind of the amazing, granular, wonderful details that you get from primary documents. I think upon reading this letter, Peggy thinks, oh no, I better go check out this Romeo to make sure he's not going to, he's not just flirting with my middle sister, especially given Angelica's elopement with John Carter 2 years before that. So, I mean, she was, in fact, just very, very important to Hamilton and his courtship of Eliza. And this thing about verifying, you always need to corroborate the opinion that you're starting to form. I was a journalist for 20 years before I started writing fiction. I always need a second source. And one of the corroborations is not only McHenry calling her Swift's Vanessa and the Madame that I think the French aristocrat that Jess is going to talk a little bit more about, calling her endowed with a superior mind. 3 weeks after that famous Winter's Ball, I know much of what I do about Peggy because of Hamilton constantly dropping gossip about her in his love letters to Eliza. And 3 weeks after meeting Peggy, he says that he's talking about the aides de camp toasting the sisters at their table with Washington, and he basically says, I'm trying to find my quote. He says basically that Peggy is generally his toast, and Captain B, he dismisses it. He's not good enough for her because he's not intelligent enough for her. He's not clever enough. That was the word. He's not clever enough for her because he sings well, and that is all. So anyway, Jessie, it was, I tell you, reading, I'm always speaking in schools, and I'm always telling kids, and I know Jessie does this too, with the tours that come to the museum. There is nothing more wonderful than primary documents because you hear them whispering into your ear from long ago. And Hamilton kind of shouts in his letters, you know, who he is, you know, this wondrously fluid writer, poetic, angsty, vulnerable, you know, they are amazing.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. Jessie, could you tell us a little bit about, Hamilton and Peggy's relationship, how it developed as they got older? They stayed close, right?
They definitely stayed really close. He is constantly referencing her in letters. He's actually one of my best sources for kind of pinning where Peggy is, because he'll tell Eliza, oh, I've seen your sister. At one point, he's telling Eliza something like, I forget what it was, like salted beef or something from Peggy for you. So they're close. And he, not to get too sad, but he is with her when she dies, and he stays in Albany specifically to be with her, which I think speaks a lot to the friendship they shared over those years.
Yeah. Yeah, it was special. I really do think it was. And you had told me too, because I should preface all this, the reason that we're so happy to be talking with Jessie here now is my novel, the biographical novel that I've done, it ends in 1782, and I didn't really research beyond that. One of the things that you told me recently is that you'd found a letter where he says that he's sending the children to Peggy, for Aunt Peggy for education, right?
Yeah, I have that part of the letter here actually. So this is one way that we kind of were able to, show off Peggy's intellect even more. So Philip Schuyler is kind of trying to lure Hamilton to bring the kids up to Albany, which he does every summer, every chance he can get. And he writes to him in 1799 and says, I hope my beloved Eliza is in better health than when we left her. I'm persuaded a change of air would benefit her, and we entreat her to come up as speedily as possible and to bring at least the two youngest children with her. Johnny will be attended to by his aunt and myself, and from his own avidity to acquire information, he will not suffer from his absence from school. So his aunt is definitely Peggy. She is the only Schuyler sister who stayed in Albany and who was there at the time. So we have no doubt that that is who's teaching Johnny. And I mean, for that to be a selling point, to Hamilton to take his kid out of school, it's pretty cool.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful.
So Peggy stays in Albany in part because she ends up marrying this guy, Stephen. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so Stephen Van Rensselaer III is what's called a patroon, basically a Dutch landowner who has all these farmers, these tenant farmers, pay him lease on his almost million acres of land around Albany. So he's pretty wealthy, to say the least. He is actually still the 10th wealthiest American to have ever lived. So
Wow.
Peggy, she did really well.
Yeah, he did too.
Um, he did. Yeah, he really liked Peggy. There's a letter where Schuyler basically is telling him to kind of calm down a bit, we think, and to not like back off, but to, approach her with less enthusiasm, I guess. He seems to be very excited about this. He's 19, she's 25, so he was still not even done with his schooling. He actually didn't even have the land or the manor house that they would live in Albany yet. That was still under the care of a man named Abraham Pembroke, who took over the manor when Stephen's father died. So Stephen and Peggy, they will live out a lot of their lives in Albany. They'll go to New York City as well, but the manor home, that's in Albany, and that makes her really only Schuyler to stay in Albany. The other closest one would be Saratoga, and that was about almost a day's journey for the Schuylers.
That's interesting. I can't help but think, because he becomes very political and holds office. He's both state delegate, lieutenant governor, and
Senator, state
yeah,
senator.
not in her life though, right? I mean, he's the lieutenant governor. And I noticed that he helped start the Albany Library. Surely, I can't imagine that she didn't have some influence on that. Don't you think?
I would imagine she did. She's so well read, she's so well educated, and I mean, from that early letter where he seems so excited to be marrying her, clearly he would have valued her for her opinion, for herself, and I don't think she would have married someone who didn't. So we get references later on from the French aristocrat Madame de la Tour du Pin, who says Peggy, even though she's ill at that point, is reading newspapers and is really up to date on politics. And clearly she's well educated. She was continuing the education, and I would just imagine that she would encourage Stephen, to say the least, to start things like the library. And this is sadly after her lifetime, but he does found what's now still one of the biggest colleges in the area. And you have to wonder if even after her death, she had some impact on him there.
Yes, you would think. You would think so. I know I think we have an image of of Madame, but I know you all have a hieroglyphic. Am I saying that right? There's a film of Madame in the mansion now when people come in.
Yes,
Right? Yeah.
we have a video of her where she speaks to visitors. It's really great, and a lot of people don't know about her, but I will get someone on tour every now and then who knows everything about her and is so excited that she's included. So she has some really great quotes about Peggy, and I will say she has a really good memory. She's writing her memoir was actually a letter to one of her children, and it really captures a lot of her life, but specifically her time in and around Albany really well. And she says something just really wonderful about Peggy. I think I've got it here. Some of it you referenced earlier, but she says that after meeting the Schuylers, who were really kind to her, and if anyone's been to the mansion, this is in the video. She says that Schuyler now says she is like a sixth daughter to him. So she has very good things to say about him. But 2 days after that, she's at the manor house with Peggy, and she said, she was received with kindness, thoughtfulness, and a friendship which did not waver for a moment. And she goes on to say, Mrs. Rensselaer was a woman of 30, speaking well the French, which she had learned while accompanying her father to the headquarters of the American and French armies. She was endowed with a superior mind and uncommon faculty of judgment of men and things. For years she had not left her house when her health was destroyed, often pinned down for months to her armchair, and the attacks of which illness led her to her tomb a few years later. Simply reading the newspapers had taught her the state of the parties in France, the faults which had led to the revolution, the vices of the upper class of society, the madness of the middle class. With extraordinary insight, she had penetrated the causes and effects of the troubles in our country better than we did. She was very impatient to meet Monsieur de Talleyrand, who had just arrived in Philadelphia and returned from England within 8 days. So she's complimenting Peggy big time, and she doesn't always do that to people in her memoir.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Jessie, because this was one of the things that I read so fast as I was trying, because I had to write the book quickly to kind of ride the Hamilton wave. And I was so struck by how large a praise that was, because she was not that complimentary about most Americans. And actually, if I can take a minute, this is, you and I have talked about how you take the difficulty, right, of trying to research 18th century women when we only have so much left of them, and putting them in context of their lifetime to really understand how kind of phenomenal the Schuyler sisters were in their independent thinking, and how well read they were, and how articulate they were about politics. Reading this from Madame allowed me to take something from Hamilton and create a plot point. If I may take a few minutes to talk about that for all you budding writers out there here. It's a jigsaw puzzle, how you put together a story in many ways. Because I had read that from Madame, that corroborated the fact that Peggy was so fluent in French, and had this facility for language and a diplomacy capability, and certainly a sophistication of thought. One of the things Madame says is that she had, as you just read, that she had really honed her skills in French by going with her father to the French encampments. Now just hang on to that for a second, a thought. Going back to Hamilton's letters, the gossip that he would drop about her was so wonderful, like there was a kiss by a carriage. And at one point, he mentions, I'll just read this to just reassure you guys that you can go to the website, we'll talk about it at the end, to read some of these letters. On September 3rd, 1780, Hamilton is engaged to Eliza at this point. He thanks her for this pretty little song that she sent him to reassure him of her affections. He then goes directly from that to talking about this pretty little Dutch girl of 15 who's around the camp, and evidently the aides de camp are quite taken with. And he reassures Eliza that he won't pay any attention to her for a reason that I won't go into right now, because it's quintessential Hamilton and not particularly flattering. Although he is, in essence, giving a backhanded compliment to Eliza. He's saying that he has no interest in a woman who has no soul. But then he goes immediately to, when your sister, he's talking about Peggy, when your sister returns home, I shall try to get her in my interest and make her tell me of all your flirtations. Have you heard anything more of what I hinted to you about Fleury? When she returns, give my love to her and tell her I expected she would have outstripped you in the hymeneal line. Now, there are all sorts of things to unpack in that letter, but we'll just focus on who the heck was Fleury, right? This is the only indication that I had that there was, and I later corroborated that Fleury was indeed thinking of potentially marrying Peggy so that he and Hamilton would be connected. In tracking Fleury, he actually, so I immediately thought, oh my God, who's that? And what is this about? Fleury is this hidden hero, really. He was the hero of Stony Point. He is a Lafayette-like Frenchman who comes on his own volition to volunteer for the Continental Army. He later returns and comes back with Rochambeau, but he comes here, he volunteers. He obviously has some connection with Peggy, some kind of romance, because of, as you said, we can track her whereabouts, frankly, from where Hamilton is talking about her, and y'all helping me track where that meant that she would be, besides the fact that she was in Albany and could witness, for instance, her father running this incredible spy ring. It makes sense that she was in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, at a time Angelica was there. Anyway, that they could meet. And because of what Madame said about her intellect and her understanding politics of the time, it allowed me to create a plausible plot point where Peggy can actually serve as kind of an interpreter between a French guard and Rhode Island fishermen who aren't real happy about the fact that Rochambeau's army has encamped themselves on their town, and include Fleury in that. By reading these different memoirs of Rochambeau's people, I found out that there was this incredible conference with the Oneida during the time that she logistically would have been there. And that all comes from noticing things like what you just read from that letter. Madame complimenting her French, but also that she would have learned it by going with, Schuyler. So, I mean, that's how you kind of track those things. I will tell you that Fleury was one of only 8 people given a Congressional Medal of Honor during the American Revolution because he led this suicidal, bayonet-only charge up the cliffs into Stony Point. And the only way I found that was I managed to stumble up onto an Army, the Corps of Engineer website that still gives the Fleury Medal. So that's the wonderful kind of trail of crumbs, right? You have to follow to be able to create these lives. Anyway.
Great. I want to take a little bit of a sidestep. You know, we've been sharing such great anecdotes about Peggy, but I know that that one of the things that you all at the Schuyler Mansion have researched and studied was how the Schuylers and the Hamiltons survived the yellow fever of 1793. And given everything that's happening in the world right now, I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit about what that was and how they survived that and all of that. So Jessie, I'd love to hear about that.
Absolutely. So we have a tour normally, not this year right now, sadly, all about Hamilton. And part of what we talk about is this yellow fever epidemic of 1793, because there was an epidemic almost every summer. But that one is the one that, if you learn about yellow fever epidemic, that's the one you'll learn about in school, because it was just so horrific, especially in Philadelphia, which is where the Hamiltons were living when this happened. And they had the right idea. They moved out of the city, but they didn't move far enough or fast enough. And Schuyler always, every summer, would beg Hamilton to send Eliza and the children to Albany. And not just because he wanted to see them, which he did, but because he knew that yellow fever is dangerous in the port cities. That was where it was spreading fastest. And Albany, where they're at this removed estate, they would be safer, basically. So they kind of made the wrong choice. They don't go to Albany that summer, and that's because Hamilton's busy with work, and maybe they just figure, well, we're removed from the city, we'll be safe enough. But Hamilton has already come down with yellow fever, and they don't understand how it spreads at that point. So Eliza quickly takes the kids away, and she basically quarantines them in the home next door. And one of her kids later recalls this really sweet but kind of heartbreaking thing where every morning his mother would come up to the window and wave to him to let the children know that she was still okay. But one morning she doesn't appear, and they're sent to Albany because she has yellow fever as well. And despite many people dying of yellow fever, especially in Philadelphia, the Hamiltons end up surviving, partially because they're treated by a different doctor, Ned Stevens, who was Hamilton's childhood friend from the Caribbean. And he was using Peruvian bark, or quinine, instead of the usual purgatives and bloodletting that other doctors like Benjamin Rush were using. So that's, I think, partially why they survive. And after that, they kind of go on this quest to get to Albany and be with their children again. And it's really difficult because cities don't want them there. Just having been in Philadelphia is one reason they don't want them. Another is because they actually had yellow fever. And they don't, understand when you're, not what they thought would be contagious anymore. So they get eventually, after a long journey, right across the river from Albany, and they're about to head over. You could see Schuyler Mansion from across the river, and someone says, "Oh, the Albany Common Council has just issued a decree that anyone from Philadelphia, especially anyone who's had yellow fever, you can't come into Albany," where basically they're locking down the city. Hamilton gets so upset. And, Schuyler, of course, helps. They have them examined by almost every doctor possible, including Schuyler's personal doctor. And they eventually are allowed to come to Schuyler Mansion, but there's a few stipulations. I think one of the ones we might not expect is that they have to burn their clothes, because once again, they don't know how yellow fever spreads. So this is one safety precaution they're taking. And They do that, they get to Schuyler Mansion, but I think one of the major things is once they're there, nobody can leave the mansion, nobody at all, nobody can leave the property, and the amount of time they have to do that for is 14 days, which, every time we talk about this on tour, because we do bring it up now more than ever, people are always really shocked that it's the same amount of time. I mean, the connection is pretty strong, but they are reunited with their family. They survive, and they survive the following epidemics almost every year in Philadelphia and New York City.
That's amazing. It's very inspiring to hear those kinds of things. Jessie, just so people know, the yellow fever was spread through mosquitoes, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Hmm. So that's why in the port cities it was such a problem, I'm guessing.
Yeah, they were coming up on boats basically and then breeding in kind of the barrels of water. So in the summer, yeah, it was not good.
That makes sense. Huh. And were there a lot of, was there an assumption that it was coming in on the ships mistakenly? Did they understand, did people really understand that they didn't, did they, that it was mosquitoes?
I don't think they did because they seemed to think it was something that could be passed from person to person.
Mhm.
And I mean, there's actually, I can't remember if it's specifically yellow fever. I believe it might be references to people wearing what we would equate to masks right now, which is putting cloth over their, mouth and nose because they don't understand the illness still. And they, yeah, I don't think they knew it was mosquito borne at that point.
It's interesting when you look at photographs with from the World War One flu epidemic. Everyone is masked, right? I mean, it's the common sense thing, right? So um, anyway, I'm sure you feel this. When times are difficult, as they are now for so many people, I honestly always think back to the Schuylers. I've written a lot about World War II. My family would laugh about this after. Say, well, nobody's dropping bombs on me, so it's a Luftwaffe is not flying over us, so it's not that bad. But I really do take a lot of solace and I hope and inspiration from what, in particular, the time that you all interpret and talk about all the time. I think the thing that stunned me so much about what I was reading, of course, everything about the Schuylers was just so fascinating, and they were so important, critically important to the Patriots' effort in upstate New York. And most people just don't really realize about, there was an invasion from Canada. It wasn't just the Battle of Saratoga, and all these other kind of, terrible Civil War things basically going on neighbor to neighbor. But I was so amazed by, like with his spy ring, I got so excited about finding this little yeoman named Moses Harris, who just happened to stumble up on some loyalist couriers, and he was on his fourth or fifth re-enlistment that he decided he was going to do. And he just smelled a skunk, basically, in his words, and chatted these guys up and got these letters and came to Philip Schuyler, and I perhaps even saved us from the British invasion, or helped. And there were so many people like that, so many just ordinary people, maybe couldn't even read or sign their own names, who just stayed the course and, stood by one another. If readers out there, if you're really interested, there's an amazing memoir by Joseph Plum Martin, who managed to survive every major battle somehow, just and wrote kind of, phenomenal. Fleury shows up in that, as a matter of fact. So I hope, thank you for sharing that story. I hope it kind of helps people think, we can get through this if we're sensible and we take precautions and we take good care of one another. So anyway.
Well, I think that's a really lovely note. We need to start wrapping up, and I think that's a really lovely note to almost end on. But I just wanted to ask, the two of you one last question about, we've talked a little bit, and I know that both of you have in your research talked about, these brilliant women that weren't really able to do as much as we wish they could and were limited by the gender politics of the time. So I'm curious, if Peggy was alive today, what you think she might be doing, or what you think she would be involved with, or how she would be working. I'd just be curious to hear what you think she'd be doing.
Jessie, you go. I
Oh
know.
man.
Oh, you want me to? I'll start.
You start.
I think Miss Swift's Vanessa. I think she would be out there running for office. I think she would be, advocating and organizing for women and education. I think she would revel in the fact now that she can be part of the narrative, right? As that Swiss Vanessa. What about you?
Yeah, I absolutely picture her running for some sort of office, being an advocate for many different causes. I think maybe especially education, since she would, if we're equating her to now, she would have been given a pretty good one. So maybe she would want that for other, especially girls as well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I can see her just doing so much without the limitations of her time period and doing, in a way, what her brothers could have done but didn't really do by
Yes.
being involved in politics and the law. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Schuyler women, Philip Schuyler was so extraordinary in all the different, problematic, but extraordinary both. But, those women, those were steely, even including Catherine, who we didn't get a chance to talk about. But my God, she gave birth 15 times, right? And over 25 years and, ran the house and entertained Johnny Burgoyne when he was dumped, they were amazing women. Jessie, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Tell about the book that you were involved with, because I think it's a wonderful set of essays that people might be interested in.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was really lucky to be involved with a book called Fierce Essays by and About Dauntless Women. And I didn't write about a Schuyler. I wrote about Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Revolution. And, speaking of stories of hope, she is one that I find hope from, because not only did she manage to fight in the war and was only discovered to be a woman when she fell ill in Philadelphia. But she actually goes on the first speaking tour for a woman in the US, which I find pretty incredible. And she comes from a really difficult background of being an indentured servant. Her family, even when she's married, doesn't have much money, and she partially goes on that speaking tour to be the breadwinner for her family. So
Wow.
she was a strong woman.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the revolution was just full of women like that. So thank you so much for describing that. People should read that. It was a fascinating essay and profile.
Well, thank you both so much for, being strong women in your own right, and for researching strong women, and
It's a good trio here.
this wonderful conversation we've had tonight. It's been really wonderful. For those of you that are watching, please be sure to check out the Schuyler Mansion website and Laura's website, lmelliott.com. And thank you all so much. And thank you, Laura and Jessie.
Thank you, and happy birthday, Peggy.
Happy birthday.
Yeah,
Peggy.
Happy birthday, Peggy.